music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. So today is my birthday month, and for a present, I would very much appreciate you telling two friends about China Econ Talk. If you're listening to this show, presumably there is someone else in your life who is also interested in China or economics or technology or whatever else we talk about on this show. So what does Boeing, lithium-ion batteries, the Central Committee, and late 1970s diplomatic maneuvering have in common? Why? Neil Thomas, of course, research associate at Macro Polo and longtime friend of the show. Neil, welcome to China Econ Talk.
Thanks, Jordan. Great to be here.
Let's kick ourselves off this week with your very long and extensive piece about Boeing's place in U.S.-China relations. You write that the relation between Boeing and China shows how structural changes in the international system over the past 5 decades have affected the commercial calculus of a powerful international firm. So before we dive into the history, I'm curious what caught your eye and got you down this rabbit hole in the first place?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things that I'm most interested in is exploring kind of under-examined areas of U.S.-China relations. And I think in general, the history of business and multinational corporations in China hasn't received quite the attention that it deserves vis-a-vis, the obviously important political history and cultural history and social history. So I feel like companies like Boeing, KFC, and that's another one I've looked at, they've been huge actors in this bilateral relationship. And Boeing just happens to be one of the biggest and most interesting. So I think it behooves us to study how they've affected bilateral relations, especially, at the moment, given that trade and companies' relationship with China is really under the spotlight under the Trump administration.
So have you ever ridden on one of those 737 Maxes?
I'm not sure I have, actually. I mean, I kind of came to Boeing as someone interested in history and US-China relations rather than someone who was interested in aviation per se. Like I had a friend in high school who was a plane spotter and, used to go to the airport to look at the new planes landing, follow flights on like flighttracker.com. And I kind of thought he was crazy, but at least like doing this piece has made me realize how interesting this is and like how important it is to geopolitics and to economic globalization.
So currently Boeing's second biggest market outside the US and China, and Xi's jet is actually a 737. Boeing planes currently fly hundreds of millions of Chinese nationals domestically in China and as well as to places abroad. So let's go all the way back to 1972. What's the connection between the Nixon administration, China, and Boeing?
So everyone's familiar with when Nixon went to China in February 1972. This was the big opening the US made in the Cold War to, align itself more closer with Beijing in an effort to, exert strategic pressure on the Soviet Union and Moscow. One of the things that is lesser known about that trip to China is that while he was there, Nixon personally approved a request from his Chinese interlocutors to buy 10 Boeing 707s. Now, this was something that would require such high-level approval because jetliners are an apex technology. So they're very hard to build, and they're something that the US kind of kept to its allies and countries that it was friendly with during the Cold War.
Can you explain this apex technology concept?
For sure. Basically, it just means that jetliners are really, really hard to build. So it involves a huge amount of not only engineering expertise, but expertise at avionics, it's electronics, software systems, and also like project management to pull it all together and to make sure that it's safe as well as that it works and that it works perfectly well every single time. If you think about a plane, there's just so many different components that go into it, and there's really nothing more complex in transportation than a jetliner, at least on the civilian market. Yeah, it's one of those kind of extremely important technologies that underpins an entire global economy, and that's air travel.
All right, so back to Kissinger and Nixon and China. So what were the motivations for Nixon to start selling planes to communist Mao-dominated China? It's crazy to think just how early this was.
Yeah, it was very early, actually. And actually one of the things that's kind of often overlooked about late Maoism is that the high point of the Cultural Revolution was in the late 60s. The PLA had basically, stamped out the Red Guards by 1969. So from then on, we see like a process of, slow but gradual economic recovery, and things are getting better in the early 1970s before Mao dies and Deng kind of launches Reform and Opening in 78. But yeah, so in one part of this is that China wanted to bolster its transport sector domestically. It wanted to to have good airplanes, because it really didn't. It only had about 350 to 500 planes for the entire country for commercial use at that point. And a lot of these planes were very old. They're sometimes propeller planes, a lot of kind of obsolete Soviet technology from the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, we've had plenty of famous Chinese politicians mysteriously, or perhaps not so mysteriously, die in plane crashes in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Presumably, some of these deaths are just due to the crappy Soviet planes that everyone was flying on.
For sure. Though actually, the plane that Lin Biao crashed on in Mongolia in 1971, I think it was actually a British plane, a British jet line.
Oh.
I have to go back and check that, so don't quote me on it, but it was one of the more recent, more modern, and perhaps foreign imports that had come in 1970, 1971 time. I think it crashed basically because of, it was either pilot error or the fact that they ran out of fuel over Mongolia, but there was certainly a lot of crashes before then due to bad technology, bad training, inadequate kind of air traffic control. China was one of the least safe air markets in the entire world. Yeah, so one of the reasons, that was why Mao and why China wanted to acquire these jetliners. But from the point of view of Nixon and Kissinger and the Washington administration, developing an American dependence on jetliners would be a way of kind of drawing Beijing even further away from Moscow, on which it had previously been dependent for jetliner technology, to Washington. And it was one quite significant but overlooked part of this turn from Sino-American estrangement to Sino-American rapprochement.
Yeah, Kissinger has this line that you quote saying, "Our interest in trade with China is not commercial. It is to establish a relationship that is necessary for the political relations we both have." But on the other hand, it's also interesting because a side effect of kind of buying into an American-led APEC technology is that it's not just the planes you're getting. You have to get the trainers, you have to get the repair, the repair parts. It's a whole infrastructure that you're kind of buying into. So once you decide to pick whichever plane you're going to buy, be that Boeing or Airbus, you're locked into to buying into that whole system, which is a multiplier of just the upfront ticket price of the planes themselves. So getting China hooked on Boeing, I think the administration as well as Boeing itself realized was a potentially huge opportunity for them, even as early as the mid-1970s. So coming to the 1980s, how does Geiger Kaifan impact this relationship?
So Reform and Opening, which Deng Xiaoping kind of gets started in 1978, is, it's a huge boost for Western companies like Boeing, indeed companies from all over the place, because it's the start of this commitment towards marketizing China's economy. The foreign technology, foreign trade, foreign investment gradually begins to become more welcome, and Western business people have been obsessed with the China market for centuries and centuries. So these kind of long dormant fantasies about doing business in China kind of get reawakened by Reform and Opening. And so, Boeing, for instance, it sets up its first China office, a one-person office in 1980, and it begins to start to sell a large amount of planes to China. So it's done two deals in the 70s, one in 72, the first one, and another in 78, which is, about $150 million each in money then. But over the 1980s, they sell, in the couple of $1 billion worth of planes. And it's starting to get into the dozens and dozens of planes now that China has acquired from Boeing. And that's basically just a response to, rising demand in China for air travel, which tracks relatively closely to rising incomes that begin to flow from the economic reforms that Deng introduces.
But the Chinese weren't necessarily completely satisfied by just buying Boeing planes. Why don't you tell the story of the Y-10?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, China did buy a lot of airplanes from Boeing and other suppliers early on. It was kind of obvious for industry observers from almost the very outset that China preferred to build rather than buy whenever it can. And so one manifestation of this was that Chinese authorities demanded, local production contracts as part of agreements to purchase planes, whereby, Boeing would subcontract out a small component like, vertical fins or, cabin doors to a Chinese supplier. So they begin to learn how to build these things and also, inject money and jobs into the Chinese economy. But they also wanted to build a quote unquote Chinese Boeing. And this is where the Yun 10 or the Y-10 comes in. It was actually a project to build a Chinese jetliner that was begun during the Mao years, perhaps as early as 1970, by members of the infamous Gang of Four, actually, which apart from Jiang Qing were all senior cadres based in Shanghai, kind of helped Mao solidify the Cultural Revolution in Shanghai. And that's kind of one of the reasons why they kind of were catapulted into the top of elite politics in Beijing. And so they figured out that the Imperial West and the Soviet revisionists had these amazing jetliners, and so China should kind of get in on the act too, because China had recently built its own atom bomb, its own hydrogen bomb, its own satellite. So they started this project.
How hard could planes be?
Yeah. Extremely difficult, as they found out. So they begun doing this in the early 70s. And wouldn't you know it, in 1972, the authorities in Beijing agreed to buy 10 of these Boeing 707s. And that's the first deal that Boeing signs in China, as we alluded to earlier. So the Shanghai Aviation Industrial Corporation, which is the unit running this project, becomes very interested in these Boeing 707s and the 40-odd, highly advanced Pratt & Whitney engines that come with the deal. And they begin to work on what has been referred to as a virtual clone of the Boeing 707 in their facility in Shanghai. And this reverse-engineered aircraft is called the Yun 10 or the Y-10. And so it takes a long time for them to do this reverse engineering because the Chinese economy and the Chinese scientific sector has been rather decimated by the Cultural Revolution and general neglect over the last couple of decades. But in September 1980, it's actually a visiting delegation of American engineers kind of stumble across this plane in a hangar that are touring in Shanghai. Someone obviously forgot to get the memo to close the door on the hangar, but they see this thing. It's kind of labeled the Y-10, and it looks exactly like a Boeing 707. And this is how it kind of gets discovered. But this plane, has its maiden flight in 1980, and it can fly. It flies to Urumqi in Xinjiang. It flies to Lhasa in Tibet, and it basically works. But the problem is that it doesn't work nearly as well as the latest generation of Boeing or Airbus planes. Engineers struggle to pinpoint the center of gravity, and the materials they use, like steel rather than aluminium, made the plane really heavy and really fuel inefficient. So basically, it was taking a long time even to reverse engineer these, ladder grade Boeing 707s in the early 1980s. So a decision was made in Beijing basically to scrap the Y-10 project because they figured that, they were going to have much more success in just opening up air travel and in stimulating the domestic economy by buying much more advanced models from overseas. And so, from Boeing and from Airbus. The funding was cut in 1984. And the last Y-10 now sits rather forlornly outside of the COMAC facility in Shanghai, where it is actually kind of seen as an inspiration for China's current efforts to build its own jetliner, the C919.
So, on my YouTube rabbit holes, every once in a while I come onto these videos of people flying classic planes. So these videos of like World War II veterans getting back into Spitfires, and they come out and say, "Oh my God, this is such a joy to fly." It reminds so many great memories, and like it controls so much better than all this new stuff. I'm not sure there are too many people with such positive memories of a plane that had center of gravity issues. That sounds a little concerning, but interesting that it's still, you can still go and check it out on your next visit to Shanghai.
Yeah, there's actually kind of interesting debates in the Chinese, blogosphere, where people argue about the real reason that the funding was cut. Like, were Boeing and Airbus kind of conspiring with traitorous elements of the Chinese government to strangle China's aerospace development in its crib? Like, were there bribes involved, or was it total incompetence, and that it was a real shame for the Chinese nation that they couldn't do this by themselves yet? So actually, it's a very contentious source of debate amongst Chinese economic nationalists online and those who favor a more internationalist system. So it's still it's a live issue that there's a lot of very positive and adulatory profiles of the Y-10's engineers and its kind of project leads that are in state media. So it's still very much part of the living memory of China's techno-nationalist aspirations.
I think an article, if you want to write it, about Chinese U.S.-China economic conspiracy theories, I think that could be something definitely worth an episode for sure.
Oh yeah, I'm actually thinking about writing something that's more specifically focused on the Y-10 and kind of getting into what it means, what it meant at the time, what it means today, and kind of how it's remembered, how it kind of feeds into this desire for technological independence in these apex technologies.
Can you fly it in any Chinese video games?
That I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. I also never played those simulator airplane video games. Wasn't cool enough.
So in the 1980s, one more bit about it. You had this great quote of Reagan saying that he admired the free market spirit of, quote, so-called communist China, and said that it was unnecessary for, quote, us to impose our form of governments on some other country, which I think is an interesting reference point for the current debate we have today in the U.S.
For sure.
Anyways, neither here nor there. Back to 1989 to 2001, and the broad arc of this was the MFN debate. So what was going on there, and how did Boeing fit into all of this?
So MFN refers to most favored nation, which is a status that a country gives to another country, which means that that recipient country can kind of enjoy all of the trade benefits that it grants to everyone else. So MFN status for China was something that was initially granted in 1980 by Jimmy Carter, helped along by a little bit of lobbying from Boeing in Congress. But this was something that was particularly important for China because there was an amendment to Trade Act in 1974 called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that meant that the MFN status for any quote-unquote non-market economy, which restricted immigration, which includes China, had to be reissued by the president every single year. So it wasn't just a case of a one-off, right, we're going to grant China most favored nation status in 1980, that's it. The president had to keep on making a decision to renew that status because China fell under this Jackson-Vanik Amendment. So Reagan renewed the MFN status without any controversy throughout the 1980s. And actually the quote you mentioned before kind of goes to show how China's U.S. policy towards China in the 1980s was very much shaped by the Cold War and the desire to keep China on side as a way to pressure the Soviet Union. And that really kind of dominated elite decision-making towards China right up until the fall of communism and Tiananmen Square. So MFN status wasn't an issue in the 1980s, but then you have the Tiananmen Massacre in 1989, June 4th, and this totally flips the American public's perception of China. Public opinion literally goes from about 70% positive a month or two before the crackdown to about 30% positive a month or two afterwards. It's a huge flip.
Wow.
China's profile in American politics, in American domestic politics, rises really sharply because of this, particularly with regard to democracy and human rights, which are becoming increasing focuses of American foreign policy since the Carter administration in 77 to 81. And Congress began to assume and assert a much greater role for itself in US-China relations. And so this MFN status that China has, the requirement for the president to renew it every year, just happened to provide a very convenient focus point for pressure on the Bush 41 administration on its China policy, because they wanted to basically maintain a policy of what they dubbed engagement, that is, continuing high-level contacts with Beijing, in an effort to kind of manage the fallout from Tiananmen and to continue to draw China into global institutions, into global trade, into global security arrangements. Because America and China were very close in security policy in the 1980s because of the continuing Soviet factor. And so MFN became this convenient focus point for critics of China who wanted to use access to American markets, that is, tariff-free access to American markets, which is what MFN gave, to pressure China to improve its performance on human rights, to improve a whole range of things that they thought could be changed by potentially cutting this MFN status and making Chinese exports to America much more expensive, and therefore likely severely reducing them. And so right throughout his administration, George H.W. Bush manages to survive some really intense congressional fights over MFN status. He manages to maintain MFN status in 1989, 1990, 91. Basically, yeah.
It's interesting thinking about this like recurring vote thing. It almost reminds me of the debt ceiling fights, where every 2 years there's an opportunity for everyone to kind of voice their opinion on the debt, on the federal government debt, just like you kind of had this nice little focal point for everyone who was upset with the way the Chinese government handled 1989 to voice their frustration and frustration with Chinese policy. But it's interesting how you talk a little bit about how MFN had impacts on Chinese internal politics. You want to go there for a little bit?
I think MFN status...
I didn't ask that super well. Let's do that one time. So, all right, we'll just cut the debt ceiling thing is not really relevant. So how did most favored nation status impact in Chinese domestic? So how did most favored nation status impact Chinese politics domestically?
Well, most favored nation status was something that the central leadership in Beijing was incredibly keen on, because, China was beginning to become more of an export powerhouse. It was beginning to rely a lot more on trade for its economic growth, mostly through cheap and lower-end manufacturing, but increasingly moving up the value chain. And MFN status was essential, really, to remain competitive in the American market, which was a not insignificant part of Beijing's overall trade. But there were some domestic constituencies that were very opposed to economic opening with the West, and that's primarily found in the state sector. So big state-owned enterprises that stand only to lose from reform, to lose from being competed against by foreign imports, to lose from the market reforms that would be necessary to join the global trading regime, and that would lose from competition from foreign invested firms that were starting to spring up in China. And so you see these domestic constituencies within China actually try to organize on a higher level as China begins its more serious World Trade Organization accession talks in the late 90s, particularly with the US. So someone like Zhu Rongji, the Chinese premier in the late 90s, who kind of led this WTO accession effort, he had significant domestic constituencies who were saying that he was basically trying to sell out China to the Americans, and that WTO accession would be the end of party control in China. And it's really interesting to think about, how much resistance there was in some parts of the Chinese government to WTO accession, whereas the memory in Washington now is that, yes, China WTO accession was this kind of vast conspiracy that Beijing managed to foist upon the world, and that China had been plotting this for a long time, which is kind of basically rubbish, because some of the hardliners in Beijing were very much against WTO accession. There really wasn't as much anticipation of, the astounding economic performance that China had in the 2000s after WTO accession as we have now.
So coming to the other side of this debate of WTO accession, you have Clinton and Bush too, both doing their part to push normalization of U.S.-China trade relations. And you write about how Clinton is perhaps best remembered for the argument that economic freedom would foster political change in China, saying that, quote, the genie of freedom will not go back into the bottle. But it's interesting thinking about just where the discussion is in 2019, how many other people agreed with that line of thinking. You have a quote from Human Rights Watch saying that trade with China is good for trade, but also for human rights and the rule of law. So this wasn't really a niche view. Basically, most people on the political spectrum really bought into the idea that more trade and more engagement would lead to political change.
That was certainly one of the important arguments made. And I mean, it's in the piece because it's one of the arguments that Boeing made, because Boeing was one of the leading corporate lobbyists in the 1990s that was fighting for China's MFN status each year, and then for WTO accession and what was called permanent normal trade relations. So no longer having to recertify China's MFN status each year, which was passed in 2000. But this was only one of many arguments that were present for China's WTO accession. Because I think right now, the shorthand you see in all of the media reporting and analysis is that Clinton let China into WTO because everyone thought China would become a democracy, and it didn't, so therefore this was a terrible mistake. But there are actually a whole lot of other arguments made for China's accession that were valid and, in terms of like the benefits realized, actually much more important. So, there was huge arguments made for, America's economy, America's trade, American consumers would benefit. Some American jobs would indeed benefit in that, the higher tech, higher value added service sectors, for instance. And also there was a need, it was felt, to, incorporate China into global trading regime, because you wouldn't really have a global trading regime without China. And there's also a need to, get China's cooperation on, bigger strategic issues like nuclear proliferation, like climate change. All of these things were big issues, even in the mid and late 1990s. And all of these were actually part of Clinton's argument for China's accession that he laid out in a major speech in March 2000. It's just that kind of modernization theory argument about trade and economic growth leading to democracy that's really stuck in our memory. Partly perhaps because it turned out not to be true. But then, like you said, a lot of people, a lot of China watchers, George W. Bush, everyone in Silicon Valley, most House Republicans, a lot of House Democrats, and a lot of prominent Chinese dissidents and Hong Kong Democrats all thought that WTO accession would be good for China's governance. And I mean, you could probably make an argument up until Xi Jinping that you were seeing progress on a lot of issues. Slow progress in an authoritarian context, for sure. But there was no guarantee that Xi Jinping was going to come along and do what he did. That was highly inevitable. So, there's a lot that's gone wrong, but that argument really wasn't even the central argument for securing China's accession to the WTO. I mean, the business and economic benefits argument was actually very prominent in those debates.
Well, there's still a big debate within the economic literature on just to what extent the quote China shock had on the U.S. economy, but Boeing most certainly was a big beneficiary. So in the 2000s, you write that China was basically the only growth market for Boeing as an early economic downturn in the early 2000s and 9/11 put a lot of brakes on big airline purchases. But at the same time, they have to start navigating COMAC, which enters the scene. So what was this organization and how did it affect the kind of calculus that Boeing was making in its engagement with China?
Yeah, so China announced its kind of revitalized plans to build a commercial jetliner like the Y-10 in 2006. And it reorganized its entire domestic aerospace industry to create COMAC, which is the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, in 2008, which is based in Shanghai, and it's a massive state-owned enterprise. And its kind of mission is to lead China's commercial aviation program. And that's got two main focuses. One is a regional jet, which is like a 75 to 90 seater airplane, which is called the ARJ-21. And the other is the flagship product, which is a narrow body jetliner, which seats about 150, 160 people, called the C919. And that's intended to compete with the Boeing 737 and the Airbus 320, which are the most common aircraft in the world and kind of underpin a lot of the fleets of most commercial aviation companies. So what's happened to an increasing extent once COMAC got started is that Boeing and Airbus, the two major jetliner companies in the world, which basically have a duopoly over these narrow body and wide body larger commercial jetliners, are being asked more and more to share their technology with China and to engage in kind of co-production agreements. And as we talked about earlier, this is not new. I mean, this is something China's had an eye on this ever since the first co-production agreements were signed in about 1980. But the level of the technology that's involved has been being turned up by COMAC. But still, I mean, there's a lot of worry about what these collaborations can do. And there are some fairly advanced collaborations, particularly on engines and avionics with, for example, General Electric. But Boeing and Airbus, whilst needing to enter into these agreements to stay competitive in China and to make sure that the other companies can eat their share of airline orders, they're not stupid about their technology transfer piece. And they've consistently tried to guard their most competitive technology from transfer to China or to anywhere, really. And I mean, there's this trick that Boeing leaders have referred to publicly for years of basically wanting to give away technology that's just about to become obsolescent and it's just about to be replaced by the next generation of technology and aircraft. So the firm has transferred technology, but it hasn't transferred the main game of what makes Boeing so innovative, what makes it the industry leader in commercial jetliners. But the pressure to do this is kind of heating up. And just last year, Boeing opened its first finishing plant, which kind of puts the finishing touches on commercial aircraft. Its first one overseas opened in Shanghai late last year. And you see a similar thing with Airbus, and the level of collaboration and cooperation is intensifying.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting comparing the experience of other countries trying to create their own domestic commercial, to create their own domestic commercial airplanes. You talk about how Korea and Japan, countries that have a lot of experience, have been able to create a lot of very successful high technology products, have really struggled on this. There's a great chapter in the book How Asia Works on the boondoggle that was the Indonesian effort to make an airline. But on the one hand, no one's ever done it before, but if there's any country that could do it, perhaps China, with its potential market size and commitment that the state is dangling in front of it, may be the one to finally break through the Airbus Boeing duopoly. In the airline industry, it's interesting that it's one of these sort of exceptions where, on the one hand, you often hear Western companies complaining about the amount of subsidies that national champions get in China, but a lot of people forget that Airbus and Boeing have huge amounts of generous R&D grants, military contracts, and tax breaks, which have really been able to build them to the place that they are today.
Yeah, and just recently, there's been some rulings handed out in a massive WTO case with suits and countersuits brought by the US government and by the European Union against Airbus and against Boeing. And whilst the EU has probably been a little bit more naughty with the subsidies that it's given to Airbus, a lot of concessional launch loans and other kind of preferential treatments, it's still true that the US has provided fairly generous R&D grants, preferential military contracts, you say, and various tax breaks at the federal and state level. And there's been some rulings for lesser amounts against the US. So it's just kind of the nature of these apex industries. They rely so much on having a very highly trained workforce, on having the ability to conduct large amounts of research and development to, kind of stay ahead of the competitors on innovation. And they are very strategically important as well, because, a lot of this technology is dual use, and because the industry, by nature, at least at the moment, it's a duopoly. So enormous commercial advantage flows to those who master that industry. At the moment, that's just the US and the EU through Boeing and Airbus. So there's, every reason to see why China would want to break into this industry, and is throwing huge amounts of resources towards trying to make that happen, even if it still has a fair way to go yet.
So I just spent 2 years at a master's program in China and China studies, and doing it, I watched a lot of iQIYI, but didn't necessarily gain too many hard skills. Had I only known that at the University of San Francisco's new Master in Applied Economics, I could have learned something to actually make me super employable. R, SQL, machine learning, all that good stuff you actually see on job listings in Silicon Valley and Zhongguancun, not necessarily have you watched all of Juan Lasong. So in this program, you can study the economics of platforms, auctions, and business strategy at the same time as you learn the tools of econometrics, experimental design, and machine learning. Plus, for all those non-US students out there, this program is designated STEM, so you can apply for a 3-year extension on your student visa and keep working in the US after you graduate. To learn more and get an application fee waiver, go to usfca.edu/Jordan. So Neil, talking about another potential apex industry, what are your thoughts on lithium-ion batteries and the electric vehicle market?
Well, they are getting much bigger is the general underlying thought that I have. So my colleague Damien and I recently published a piece in Foreign Policy about lithium-ion battery supply chains that's based on a product on the Macro Polo website, which takes you through the story of this supply chain. And basically, the finding is that if we compile all the data on what's available for the upstream, midstream, and downstream supply chain, we find that a lot of that production is concentrating in East Asia, and particularly in China. And so given that, electric cars are going to jump from something like 3 million on the road now to something like 200 to 300 million in 20 odd years time, and, are going to actually start to outnumber traditional, gas-powered cars in terms of new sales by the middle of the century. It's a really important industry. And if the United States government thinks that it's important to develop a domestic supply chain and the kind of innovation clusters and spillover benefits that result from that, then it's kind of going to need to get its act together with, funding the research and offering, kind of the early industry support it did for companies like Boeing, to what is at the moment the only really serious concern in the US that is doing this, and that is Tesla. Even though they're the kind of company that everyone loves to hate, and Elon Musk is running here and there doing all sorts of crazy things.
Having hot pot in Shanghai, right?
Yeah, and they're opening a gigafactory on the outskirts of Shanghai to produce these lithium-ion batteries, which they do in collaboration with Panasonic. They're jumping ship from the US, and it's something that the US government should think about. The US doesn't want to obviously copy the industrial policy and totally state-led growth model that China has, because there's enormous inefficiencies that result from that. But in terms of promoting policies that encourage consumers to make the switch to electric vehicles, and encouraging domestic startups and domestic mining explorers to exploit the potential and reserves that America does have, that's something that China has pursued aggressively, and it's worked. Often, these most innovative products of the next generation come out of, government or state sponsored or led or encouraged research. It's something that the US should be thinking about more seriously, particularly as it seems fairly likely that electric vehicles will, start to dominate the roads, at least by mid-century, if not a bit earlier.
Does anyone remember Solyndra? Think it just, this I think in the Obama administration in 2010 and 2011. So in the stimulus package, way back then, after the Great Recession kicked off, there was a big push to support companies and give them below market loans. So Tesla is a huge recipient of one of them, and I think there's been plenty of reporting talking about how had Tesla not gotten cheap land and cheap loans from the U.S. government, they would not be where they are today by any stretch of the imagination. So, on the one hand, it's an interesting argument you make saying that the U.S. needs to do more support for it. But actually, I think there's actually been a fair amount of, tax subsidies for these cars in the U.S., but not necessarily on the level that China has really invested into trying to make sure that they are the leaders in this field going forward.
What you refer to was the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Loan Program that did provide some crucial early support for Tesla in the form of loans and accessible credit. But it actually hasn't made a loan since about 2011. Like, it has about $16 billion of lending capacity that just hasn't used. Part of that is a supply issue. Like, you have to make sure that these companies are legit, and there were some applying that perhaps didn't deserve the loan program. But there's pretty credible reporting out there that a lot of promising startups have been waiting for money to get going for years and years now. And that there's no reason why that $16 billion that's been hanging around for 8 years now shouldn't be used to try and encourage some of these companies, even if there are a couple of failures along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason is politics. This was a front page news story, the Solyndra loans getting blown up, even though I think the overall Department of Energy portfolio ended up making a fair amount of money on all of these, all of the loans they gave out. This is just not something that China needs to worry about. The bureaucrats who are writing these checks are not up for re-election. These sorts of stories, there is not a Fox News that will be waving them in the government's face, or I guess an MSNBC. If Trump is going to be giving out loans, which people decide, which people may say they're sweetheart deals for his business associates or what have you. It's a real interesting kind of fallout from a lot of different aspects about the two countries, is that even if a president wanted to do this sort of big industrial push, it would be very difficult because it's very easy to kind of weaponize these sorts of programs in the political landscape that the U.S. currently has.
Yep, it's certainly not easy to do things like this, but I think there is a growing kind of constituency for it, especially if it's framed in this kind of industrial competition type lens. I mean, you even have some fairly prominent Republicans getting behind what is essentially industrial policy for America's tech sector because of the fear of China and China's supposedly all-conquering tech sector. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. There's a lot of dynamics shifting at the moment because of the international situations that I think might make such programs more politically palatable in the next few years.
Yeah, I know that is a really interesting dynamic to think about, what Republicans are going to think. On the one hand, you have this aversion to government handouts to companies and crony capitalism and what have you. But on the other hand, you read stories about, the U.S. is such a mess, we can't even build our own 5G network without relying on Europeans or Chinese. And whether or not those sorts of arguments will actually change the calculation of folks on the Hill is a really interesting story to follow going forward for sure. So let's talk about negotiating with the Chinese. So it's today is April 19th, and we've just had some new news saying that apparently the trade deal is going to be wrapped up in May. God knows if that's actually going to be the case. But one of the very important things that every nation has learned in negotiating with the Chinese is the importance of the language. So you have a fascinating op-ed posted a few weeks ago back in the Washington Post, which goes into the details of the Chinese and English wording of an important document in the late 1970s. So you want to tell us this story, Neil?
Absolutely, and it's relevant for the present because the US and China are currently negotiating in English, and Beijing will be decided to translate that draft agreement into Chinese. And there's some worry that in this translation, China could kind of water down some of its commitments by, playing around a little bit with the specificity or vagueness of the language in the text. And the reason why this, I think, should be something the Trump administration is paying attention to is because there's been problems that have happened in this area before, particularly with regards to the so-called normalization communique that did what it says on the cover. It normalized U.S.-China relations in 1979, although it was released in December 1978. And this is particularly relevant when it comes to the US's one China policy, where the US, it acknowledges both Beijing's claim to sovereignty over Taiwan, but also Taiwan's claim to some Taiwanese claims to independence, but it doesn't accept either of those positions. So it's kind of a diplomatic balancing act. And so the Shanghai Communique, which is kind of the famous document that Nixon and Zhou Enlai signed in Shanghai in February 1972 when he was visiting, said that the United States would, I'll quote it, acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. And so in this normalization communique, which kind of delivered on the promise of 1972 that they were going to move towards normalization, says that the US acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. So you'll notice that both those phrases start with the English word acknowledges. But when those documents are being translated in 1979, the Chinese word for acknowledges actually changes in the 1979 document. It goes from the 1972 version, which is 认识到, which is kind of, it's about like you know something, you understand it, you're acknowledging it in that sense, to the stronger verb 承认, which is more about like, assent, recognizing it in that sense. So it's a stronger sense of American acceptance of Beijing's position. And this is a bit strange because, the Shanghai Communique was kind of seen by people in the Carter administration as the holy writ of US-China relations, and they didn't want to depart from it. And it seems here that the US side has agreed to a stronger statement of Beijing's view rather than their own more independent one China policy. And I mean, this happened because the US liaison office that was the kind of de facto embassy before official normalization in 1979 managed to get convinced by the Chinese negotiating side that the word 承认 was substantively.
Oh, no big deal. No big deal.
Yeah, no substantive significance. Not any different, And there's this kind of funny quote in a memo that's sent.
It's one character shorter. We're just saving space.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Apparently, several English-Chinese dictionaries were used to help convince the American side. But there's this kind of really interesting memo that I found kind of scrolling through the archives one day that kind of forms the basis of the piece, where Michael Oxenberg, who is a kind of famous China scholar and the China kind of point man on Carter's National Security Committee, he notices this a few days after the communique has been released, and he gets very worried about this change in language. And he sends a memo to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is the National Security Advisor for Carter, kind of warning him that this mistake has been made and kind of acknowledging it as such. And he's recognized that linguists will say that this is a stronger acceptance of the Chinese position. And so this difference in language has been known for quite some time by scholars of U.S.-China relations. It's not kind of commonly known. But I mean, another thing that I found as I was kind of thinking about this memo was I kind of searched through some Chinese sources and found a document that I don't think has received any attention before. That's kind of the recollection of a Chinese government translator who reminisces about being in the room when a senior diplomat called Zhang Wenjin actually purposely changes that Chinese phrasing of 认识到 to 承认 for the normalization communique in 1979 for the stated reason at the time that this new word, 承认, was more in line with Beijing's policy on Taiwan. So this kind of shows that the canny Chinese negotiating side managed to mislead the U.S. liaison office into accepting wording that is helping China's, domestic position that, other countries should acknowledge and accept rather than just, be aware of its claim to sovereignty over Taiwan. So, this hasn't actually had much effect on US policy, but, in terms of China's, continuing efforts to try and, assert Huayuquan, discourse power, it's kind of not something you'd want them to have in their back pocket to be able to make even a contentious case that, America has accepted Beijing sovereignty over Taiwan.
If any of those language students out there need any extra motivation to get those HSK 6+ words down cold, here you go, right?
Yeah, read the Chinese, know what the Chinese means, and make your own decisions rather than having your negotiator.
Yeah, don't let Chinese people tell you what Chinese mean.
Well, I mean, to be honest, they know a lot more about it than I do. But if you're in a diplomatic negotiation, then you'd want to have the capacity on your own side to be able to make your own judgments about this. And there were some timing and chain of command issues that came into the American blunder, but you want to be making your own decisions rather than having your negotiating partner tell you what you should be thinking about things.
So Chinese diplomats have been having fun playing games with Mandarin for thousands of years at this point. So coming back to one of our favorite features on China Econ Talk, the Imperial Interlude. Back in 1044, the Liao dynasty was giving the Song a run for their money. And basically, this is the famous moment in Chinese history where the Song decided to buy off the Liao by sending them 20,000 ounces of silver, 24,000 bolts of various silk textiles, 10,000 caddies of tea. Aside from the monetary aspect of this diplomatic deal, there was also the kind of respect and where people sat on the totem pole. One of the big stresses on the part of the Song dynasty was worrying that they would have to acknowledge another ruler as an older brother or something that hasn't necessarily fit into the Chinese worldview of the Chinese Huangdi being the kind of top dog on the planet. So what the Liao and the Song diplomats agreed to was, instead of fighting as to whether or not they should call the Liao a Wang or a king or a emperor, they just settled on the word for ruler, zhu. So, as everyone's favorite imperial scholar of China, F.W. Mote, wrote, the Song agreed to bypass the delicate problem of whether to address the Xiao ruler as king or as emperor by referring to him in interstate documents simply as the ruler of Xia, or Zhu, like Zhu Ren, which I think was a pretty clever way of sidestepping the issue. And maybe this sort of creativity is just what the U.S. and Chinese negotiators need to find a solution to the current ongoing trade war.
Perhaps. So I think the Trump administration probably wants as much specificity as it can in terms of enforcement mechanisms and commitments to end technology transfer. But in terms of issues of
as long as you're getting 20,000 bolts of silk, I think the Trump administration might be okay.
If that's what it takes to buy more American soybeans, then that's what it'll take.
Neil, thanks for coming on China Econ Talk.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.